The VA just dropped a bombshell. 10 new policy changes have been quietly rolled out, and if you are a veteran, a dependent, or currently filing a claim, these updates are not just administrative tweaks. They are fundamental shifts that could drastically affect your benefits, your health care, and your financial future. We're talking about hurdles where there were previously clear paths and mandatory reevaluations for statuses you thought were permanent. This isn't fear-mongering. This is a necessity. You need to know exactly what's changing, why it's happening, and the critical steps you must take right now to protect your earned benefits. Stick with me, because the first change impacts nearly every veteran who has been near burn pits or toxic exposure, and it's the one that will cause the most immediate shockwave. The first major shockwave policy change is the introduction of elevated evidence hurdles for presumptive conditions under the PACT Act. When the PACT Act was passed, it provided a monumental shift, recognizing that certain diseases were presumed connected to toxic exposure, lifting the burden of proof off the veteran. That was the promise. The new policy, however, introduces a requirement for specific medical corroboration that goes beyond a simple diagnosis and service record. While the VA claims this is merely a measure to ensure the integrity of the claims process and manage the massive influx, for the veteran, it feels like a subtle but devastating betrayal. They are now requiring what they term longitudinal medical documentation that explicitly details the progression of the condition and, crucially, establishes a timeline that aligns perfectly with the exposure period. If your initial diagnosis was recent, but your exposure was decades ago, the gap in documentation now becomes a potential point of failure. This means that if you were relying solely on the presumptive status for conditions like certain respiratory illnesses or cancers, the VA is now empowered to delay or deny the claim based on a lack of this newly defined corroborating evidence. The impact here is twofold. Immediate claims are stalling, and previously approved claims are now being flagged for review if they lack this new level of detail. The VA is essentially saying, "We still believe in the PACT Act, but we're going to make you prove the presumption." Veterans who filed early before this new standard was fully codified may find themselves receiving requests for evidence that feel impossible to fulfill, asking for records that simply do not exist or are decades old. This shift fundamentally alters the contract the VA made with veterans regarding toxic exposure. It creates a bureaucratic moat around the benefits that were supposed to be easily accessible. We are seeing specific language targeting conditions that are often slow to manifest, requiring proof of subclinical issues during the period immediately following separation, documentation most veterans simply wouldn't have unless they were constantly seeing doctors for minor non-disabling issues. The urgency here is paramount. If you are filing a PACT Act claim, your strategy must immediately shift from "I have this condition" to "I have this condition," and here is a detailed, long-term medical narrative that confirms its insidious onset. This is a significant, resource-intensive change that threatens to overwhelm veterans already struggling with debilitating illnesses. It's not just about the diagnosis anymore, it's about the documentation trail, and the VA just moved the goalposts further down the field, demanding perfection in medical record-keeping that few veterans possess. The underlying concern is that this is a cost-saving measure disguised as a quality control measure, designed to slow the payout of billions of dollars promised under the PACT Act. This administrative tightening is the first and perhaps most painful policy shock. Moving into the second policy change, we find a radical restructuring of SAWAM, compensation and pension, C&P, exam requirements, prioritizing digital and telehealth evaluations over traditional in-person assessments. For years, the C&P exam was the sacred ground of the disability claim, the one time a veteran had to sit across from a medical professional, often a contractor, and articulate the severity and frequency of their symptoms. While telehealth certainly offers convenience, this new mandate is causing serious concern, especially for complex or musculoskeletal conditions. The VA is pushing hard to move 75% of all non-physical touch exams to digital platforms within the next fiscal year. Why is this shocking? Because critical nuance is often lost through a screen. For conditions like chronic pain, migraines, or severe mental health issues, the examiner relies heavily on nonverbal cues, gait, demeanor, and the overall physical presentation of distress, all elements that are drastically diminished in a low-resolution video call. Furthermore, this change disproportionately affects veterans in rural areas who may lack reliable high-speed internet or the necessary technological literacy, ironically creating new barriers to access under the guise of modernization. Imagine trying to demonstrate range of motion limitations for a back injury via a webcam. The examiner cannot physically manipulate the joint, cannot observe the subtle flinching, and cannot truly gauge the effort involved. The new policy requires the veteran to become their own physical therapist, meticulously recording and demonstrating their own limitations, a process ripe for misinterpretation and underestimation of severity. For mental health evaluations, the shift is equally problematic. The rapport, the trust, and the sense of safety required to discuss trauma are incredibly difficult to establish digitally, leading to potentially truncated or incomplete histories being recorded, which directly impacts the rating decision. The policy outlines new protocols for verifying identity and ensuring privacy, but it fails to address the clinical degradation of the exam itself. Veterans are being advised to record their own demonstration of physical limitations before the telehealth appointment, creating a secondary burden of proof. This change is fundamentally about efficiency and throughput, aiming to clear the backlog faster, but the risk is that speed comes at the expense of accuracy. If you receive notification that your C&P exam will be conducted via telehealth, you must aggressively over-communicate your symptoms, document every technical glitch, and, if possible, request an in-person exam, citing clinical necessity, even if the new policy attempts to discourage such requests. The VA is banking on the convenience factor overcoming the clinical skepticism, but veterans need to push back hard to ensure their conditions are accurately assessed, not merely checked off a digital list. This digital pivot is a massive gamble with veterans' health outcomes and financial stability. The third policy shock relates directly to surviving families. A significant tightening of eligibility. Criteria for dependency and indemnity compensation, DIC, specifically introducing new means testing for specific dependent categories. DIC is the lifeline for many surviving spouses and children, providing monthly compensation when a veteran's death is service-connected. Previously, while there were income considerations for certain special allowances, the basic DIC entitlement was relatively straightforward based on the veteran's service-connected death. The new policy introduces a complex, tiered system of means testing for surviving spouses who remarry after the age of 57, and for adult children who are deemed helpless but have independent assets. The most alarming aspect is the introduction of an asset cap for spouses who receive other federal benefits. The VA argues this is to prevent double dipping and ensure resources are directed to the most financially vulnerable, but the practical effect is penalizing prudent saving and long-term financial planning. For a surviving spouse who may have worked and saved diligently, their eligibility for DIC could now be jeopardized if their non-service-connected assets exceed a newly defined and relatively low threshold. This policy change requires surviving spouses to submit annual financial disclosures that mirror the complexity of tax filings, a heavy administrative burden on individuals already dealing with immense loss. The shock here is not just the financial loss, but the invasion of privacy and the implication that a surviving spouse must remain financially dependent to deserve the benefit. Furthermore, the policy creates a significant disincentive for surviving spouses to seek full-time employment or aggressively save, fearing they might cross the arbitrary asset line and lose their critical monthly support. The VA has also revised the definition of helpless child benefits, focusing less on the nature of the disability and more on the child's potential for a future earning capacity, even if that capacity is minimal due to severe limitations. This means families who have planned their financial future around the expectation of consistent DIC support for their disabled adult children are now facing potential catastrophic cuts. The complexity of the new forms alone is daunting, requiring detailed breakdowns of investment portfolios, real estate holdings, and specific retirement account balances. This is a cruel bureaucratic hurdle placed in front of those who have already sacrificed the most, forcing them to navigate a financial minefield just to retain the compensation they earned through their spouse's service. Surviving families must immediately consult with financial advisors and accredited representatives to understand how their current asset structure interacts with these new, punitive means-testing rules. The fourth major policy shift targets student veterans and the very foundation of their educational support. Significant revisions to the post-9/11 GI Bill, Chapter 33. Monthly housing allowance, MHA calculation, moving away from zip code-based rates to a new, standardized regional average. For years, the MHA was a critical component of the GI Bill, calculated based on the cost of living, Basic Allowance for Housing, or BAH, in the zip code of the school where the veteran was physically attending classes. This acknowledged that attending school in San Diego versus rural Mississippi carried vastly different housing costs. The new policy eliminates this granular, zip code-specific calculation. Instead, the VA will now use a broader, state-level or multi-county regional average, which predictably results in a substantial reduction in MHA for veterans attending school in high-cost-of-living metropolitan areas. This is a brutal financial blow. A veteran attending a university in a major city, where the local BAH rate might be $3,000, could see their MHA suddenly drop to the regional average of $2,000, creating an immediate $1,000 monthly deficit they must cover out of pocket. The VA justifies this by citing administrative simplification and equitable distribution across states. But the reality is that it places student veterans in the nation's most expensive educational hubs at severe financial risk. Many student veterans rely entirely on the MHA to cover rent, utilities, and basic living expenses. This cut forces an impossible choice: either move far away from the campus, increasing commuting time and cost, or take on significant debt just to afford basic shelter near the school. Furthermore, the policy introduces new strict requirements regarding distance learning MHA eligibility. Where previously a hybrid schedule might have qualified for the full in-person rate, the new rules significantly restrict what counts as in-person attendance, pushing more veterans into the reduced distance learning rate. This change fundamentally undermines the promise of the GI Bill to provide full educational access without financial hardship. Students currently enrolled must immediately reevaluate their budgets and housing situations, realizing that the expected MHA rate they planned for their remaining semesters is likely to be substantially lower. This policy is a silent tax on education in high-opportunity areas, potentially forcing veterans to choose lower-cost, lower-quality educational options simply to survive. Financially, the financial shock is immediate, forcing thousands of student veterans to scramble for alternative funding sources or face housing instability. The fifth policy change is one that veterans with severe disabilities must pay extremely close attention to: the implementation of mandatory cyclical reevaluations for veterans currently rated 100% total disability individual unemployability, TDIU, regardless of the permanence of their underlying conditions. TDIU is a status granted when a veteran is unable to maintain substantially gainful employment due to service-connected conditions, even if their combined rating is less than 100%. Historically, if the underlying conditions were static or permanent, e.g., loss of limb, severe chronic diseases, the TDIU status was generally considered permanent, providing crucial financial security. The new VA directive mandates a review process every 5 years for all TDIU recipients under the age of 65. The stated purpose is to verify continued unemployability and identify instances where a veteran might have returned to work without notifying the VA. However, the true shock lies in the new burden of proof placed on the veteran during the reevaluation. Instead of the VA needing evidence of improvement, the veteran must now actively prove they remain unemployable, often requiring new C&P exams focused on vocational rehabilitation potential. This is a massive administrative and psychological stressor for veterans who believed their financial future was secured. They are being forced back into the claim cycle, facing the risk of their status being downgraded if the VA determines there is any potential for gainful employment, even if that potential is theoretical or minimal. For veterans with severe chronic mental health issues, the stress of this recurring audit can be debilitating, often exacerbating the very conditions that qualified them for TDIU in the first place. The policy also introduces new scrutiny on marginal employment, tightening the definition of what constitutes substantially gainful employment and making it harder for veterans to engage in small, therapeutic work activities without jeopardizing their TDIU status. The VA is specifically targeting those who engage in any form of self-employment or gig work, requiring meticulous income reporting and potentially leading to the revocation of benefits if income thresholds are crossed, even temporarily. Veterans holding TDIU must now maintain exceptionally detailed medical and vocational records, anticipating this mandatory recurring audit. They must be prepared to demonstrate not just the existence of their disability, but the continued severity and the specific vocational impact every 5 years. This policy fundamentally removes the concept of permanent unemployability for most recipients, introducing a constant state of uncertainty and fear regarding their primary source of income. It is a clear attempt to reduce the number of veterans receiving the 100% equivalent pay rate, regardless of the human cost involved in maintaining that constant state of bureaucratic vigilance. The sixth policy change focuses on a frequently requested, yet often restricted, benefit. A drastic revision of dental care eligibility, severely restricting access for veterans rated below 100% service-connected disability. Comprehensive dental care has historically been one of the most difficult benefits to secure unless a veteran was rated 100% or had a service-connected dental condition. The new policy, however, goes further than maintaining the status quo. It actively reduces the scope of care available even for those who previously qualified under certain special provisions, like being a former prisoner of war or having a service-connected condition that affects the mouth. The shock here is the immediate removal of preventative and restorative dental care for veterans with ratings between 70% and 90%, who often rely on the VA for their full medical needs. The VA is shifting these veterans to an emergency-only dental model, meaning routine cleanings, fillings, crowns, and preventative screenings are now completely out-of-pocket expenses. This is a critical health issue, as poor oral health is directly linked to cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and other systemic illnesses. By restricting access, the VA is not saving money. They are simply deferring massive future healthcare costs onto the veteran. The EAS policy creates a two-tiered system where only the 100% rated veterans maintain comprehensive coverage, leaving hundreds of thousands of others facing immediate, significant financial burdens for basic dental hygiene. Furthermore, the new policy mandates that any dental condition claimed as service-connected must now meet an exceptionally high standard of proof, requiring a direct contemporaneous link to the service injury, making it almost impossible to claim secondary conditions like TMJ or other jaw issues resulting from combat trauma or chronic stress. Veterans must now budget thousands of dollars annually for dental insurance or risk severe health consequences. The policy is being implemented immediately, meaning appointments scheduled for routine care are being canceled or converted to fee-based services, catching veterans entirely off guard. This is a health crisis waiting to happen, forcing veterans to choose between necessary medical treatment and fundamental oral hygiene. The VA is essentially cutting a vital preventative service, trading immediate savings for long-term health deterioration and financial hardship for the veteran population. The seventh major policy change addresses a deeply sensitive area: the implementation of new restrictive gatekeeping protocols for immediate access to specialized mental health services, prioritizing long-term telehealth group therapy models over immediate one-on-one crisis intervention. The mental health crisis among veterans is well documented, and timely, personalized care is paramount. The new VA policy, driven by capacity constraints and staffing shortages, attempts to streamline access by funneling veterans presenting with non-imminent crisis issues into standardized large-format telehealth group sessions. The shock is the loss of personalized intake and the delay in accessing specialized treatment, such as trauma-focused therapies like EMDR or cognitive processing therapy, which are often critical for successful recovery. Under the new protocol, a veteran seeking help may face a mandatory waiting period in a generic group setting before they are deemed eligible for individual specialized care. The VA argues that group therapy promotes peer support and is more efficient, but for veterans struggling with acute isolation, severe PTSD, or specific combat-related trauma, being forced into a generalized group setting via video call can be counterproductive or even re-traumatizing. Furthermore, the policy introduces a new requirement for veterans to demonstrate compliance with the generalized therapy model before being approved for the more resource-intensive individual sessions. This means that if a veteran struggles to engage in the group setting, a common occurrence for those with severe social anxiety or trust issues stemming from trauma, they may be denied the specialized care they desperately need. This shift is a cost-cutting measure disguised as an efficiency improvement, rationing access to the most effective but most expensive forms of mental health treatment. Veterans must understand that when seeking help, they need to be extremely clear and direct about the severity of their symptoms and the immediate need for specialized one-on-one intervention, bypassing the default group therapy funnel if their condition warrants it. The new policy risks pushing veterans away from seeking help altogether, creating dangerous delays in critical care by prioritizing administrative ease over clinical necessity. The eighth policy shock impacts the final act of AI veterans' life and the dignity afforded to their memory. A significant reduction in the maximum monetary allowance provided for burial and funeral expenses, coupled with new restrictions on plot allowance eligibility. The VA provides financial assistance to help offset the costs associated with the burial and funeral of eligible veterans. While these amounts have historically been modest, they are vital for families facing sudden, often unexpected expenses. The new policy cuts the maximum non-service-connected burial allowance by 20%, citing rising administrative costs and a need to redistribute funds. For families already grieving, this reduction translates directly into added financial stress, potentially forcing them to choose less dignified or less comprehensive final arrangements. The true bureaucratic hurdle, however, lies in the new restrictions on the plot or interment allowance. The VA now requires extremely specific documentation detailing the cost breakdown of the plot itself, excluding any costs associated with perpetual care, monument setting, or specific religious rites, which were often partially covered or implicitly included in the previous, simpler allowance. This granular auditing of funeral costs places an enormous administrative burden on surviving families during their most vulnerable time. Furthermore, the policy introduces new stipulations regarding the distance between the veteran's residence at the time of death and the chosen cemetery, potentially disqualifying families who wish to bury their loved ones in a family plot located outside a newly defined geographic radius. The VA is attempting to centralize burials in national cemeteries, but for families with strong local ties or specific cultural burial traditions, this new rule is highly restrictive. Families must now pre-plan and meticulously document every expense, realizing that the VA's contribution to a veteran's final expenses will be significantly less and far more difficult to claim. This policy is shocking, not just for the financial cut, but for the callous timing and the administrative complexity it imposes on the bereaved. The ninth policy change directly targets the American dream of homeownership for veterans. The introduction of new stringent minimum credit score requirements for VA home loan guarantees, particularly for first-time applicants and those seeking loans above the county limit. The VA loan guarantee is one of the most powerful and important benefits, allowing veterans to purchase homes with zero down payment and often highly favorable terms. Historically, the VA itself does not set a hard minimum credit score. Rather, it relies on the underwriting standards of the private lenders. The new policy, however, introduces a mandatory baseline credit threshold that lenders must adhere to for the VA to guarantee the loan, effectively setting a hard floor. This floor is significantly higher than what many veterans, especially those recently separated, recovering from financial hardship, or dealing with medical debt, can meet. For many years, the VA loan was a path to home ownership for veterans who might not qualify for conventional loans due to lower scores. This new policy removes that safety net. The shock is that this instantly locks out tens of thousands of veterans from utilizing their earned benefit, particularly those in younger demographics or those attempting to rebuild their financial lives after difficult transitions. The VA argues this is necessary to mitigate risk in a volatile housing market, but the effect is discriminatory against veterans who need the most support. Furthermore, the policy introduces a new layer of mandatory financial counseling for any veteran whose score falls within 50 points of the new minimum, adding bureaucratic delay and cost to the application process. Veterans who had previously been pre-approved or were actively working towards purchasing a home under the old, more flexible standards are now finding themselves suddenly disqualified. This policy forces veterans to spend months or even years focusing solely on credit repair, delaying their ability to secure housing and build equity. The promise of the VA loan is being quietly eroded, limiting this essential benefit only to those who already possess strong conventional credit profiles, negating the original intent of the guarantee. Finally, the 10th policy change is perhaps the most pervasive and administratively burdensome. The mandatory implementation of an annual comprehensive health audit for all veterans receiving any level of service-connected compensation, regardless of their rating or age. This goes far beyond the existing periodic review system. The new audit requires every veteran beneficiary to complete a detailed annual questionnaire documenting their current employment status, healthcare utilization, both VA and private, and a self-assessment of their functional capacity. The VA's stated goal is to gather real-time data on the veteran population's health and economic well-being, but the underlying fear is that this is a precursor to widespread automated rate reductions. The shock lies in the sheer scope and the implicit threat of noncompliance. Failure to complete this detailed audit within a strict 30-day window can result in the temporary suspension of benefits, forcing the veteran to navigate a complex appeal process to restore their compensation. For elderly or severely disabled veterans who rely on caregivers, this annual administrative task is a massive burden. Furthermore, the audit specifically asks intrusive questions about any income earned from hobbies, side projects, or passive investments, signaling an aggressive new approach to identifying veterans who may be deemed capable of employment, even if they are rated 100% P&T, permanent and total. This mandatory audit introduces a constant state of administrative anxiety, forcing veterans to perpetually prove their continued disability and unemployability. It turns the receipt of earned compensation into an annual bureaucratic interrogation. Veterans must treat this audit with the seriousness of a new C&P exam, ensuring every answer is medically supported and carefully worded, understanding that any inconsistency could be flagged for a full formal reevaluation of their disability rating. This policy represents the VA shifting from a reactive system, reviewing when conditions improve, to a proactive, surveillance-based system, auditing everyone annually, fundamentally changing the relationship between the veteran and the department. These 10 policies, the tightened PACT Act evidence, the digital C&P shift, the DIC means testing, the GI Bill MHA cuts, the TDIU mandatory audits, the dental care restrictions, the mental health gatekeeping, the burial allowance cuts, the VA loan credit floor, and the mandatory annual health audit represent a profound and alarming shift in VA operations. They are unified by a common thread, increasing bureaucratic hurdles, prioritizing cost savings and administrative efficiency over the veteran's ease of access and financial security. The underlying message is clear. Benefits that were once considered stable or easily accessible are now under intense scrutiny. To navigate this new landscape, action is required immediately. First, documentation is everything. For any claim, past or future, you must meticulously gather every single piece of medical evidence, including private records, and ensure they speak directly to the new, elevated evidence standards. Do not rely on the VA to track down records. Assume the burden of proof is entirely on you, and that the standard of proof has doubled. Second, seek professional assistance. These changes make the claims process exponentially more complicated. Do not attempt to file appeals or navigate the new audit forms alone. Contact an accredited Veteran Service Officer, VSO, a veterans law attorney, or an accredited agent now to understand how these 10 specific changes impact your current status and future claims. The complexity of the new DIC means testing alone warrants professional financial and legal consultation. Third, prepare for the audit. If you are a TDIU recipient or receive any compensation, begin preparing for the mandatory audits by maintaining a meticulous journal of your symptoms, your daily functional limitations, and any income earned, ensuring it aligns perfectly with your current disability rating documentation. Fourth, advocate fiercely. These changes were implemented quietly, and the only way to reverse or mitigate their impact is through unified vocal advocacy. Share this information. Contact your representatives. The VA must understand that these administrative shocks are causing real, tangible harm to the population they are sworn to serve. The era of easy access to earned benefits is over. We are entering a period where vigilance, documentation, and professional representation are no longer optional. They are essential for survival. The VA has made its move. Now it is time for veterans to make theirs. Stay informed, stay prepared, and never stop fighting for the benefits you earned.